It's Writing Wednesday, and I am on the desert. Let me show you where I am. This is Joshua Tree. Front yard, it's a little bit cloudy. Oh, shoot. Okay. Hello, here we are. And that's Joshua Tree. And these are Joshua trees. And this is the house we're staying at. And I love this place a lot. Here we are. And I have limited electricity here on my phone, so I'm going to start working on your questions. So today's Writing Wednesday is about, I had a question about vulnerability in your writing. A reader asked somebody who is writing a novel that feels very autobiographical in nature and has some very specific personal violent subject matter with a family member who is somebody who is still very much in this person's life, if only through other people, and ways. Can you recommend, I don't want to reveal that it is about my own experiences. Can you recommend ways for me to distance myself from the story? Hi. I have changed the setting and the time period so that it's less recognizable. But even with that change, the idea of publishing it puts me in a very vulnerable place. How do you deal with the vulnerability involved in letting people read your work? Thank you for taking the time to read my question. So this is a question of working with autobiographical material, very sensitive, very emotionally fraught, in fiction, and publishing it. Well, this is the time where fiction writers are really glad that they're not memoirists, because memoirists have to cop to it directly. In fiction, you can pretend that it's not really you. So the first thing to do is about how do you relocate the experience in a way that it's not immediately recognizable by all concerned, especially the person who is going to be the most upset about it. Fiction is wonderful for that, because one of the reasons we write fiction is we take experiences that we are directly involved with and tell the story in a way that we give those experiences to someone else, and it gives us kind of like having asbestos mitts with which to handle this very explosive material. So say this is a violent story that we're trying to disguise who it was and when it was, and still be able to tell our story is the whole point of writing fiction. So if it's a specific order of violence, you will not be able to completely disguise it from the person who did it. On the other hand, very few people want to admit that that they've done things like that. So often if there will rarely be a kickback right to the person who did the violence. Why would they cop to that? Definitely having the story unfold No, Linda, I'm in Joshua Tree right now, and it's very cold on the desert. So I'm outside, so you guys could get a look at my environment. Um, but we're talking about vulnerability in fiction writing, and how do you portray something that actually occurred um, to the writer, a violent episode, without drawing too much attention to the autobiographical element. And it's very important that this comes out of the character's predicament, and not that you create fiction from your autobiographical impetus. That fiction is not a retelling of personal stories. A fiction is creation of a fictional world with its own rules, with its own logic, and then events arise from that situation. If it's too close to the autobiography, it's not really fiction yet. If you create a character who's very different from you and give the emotions and give the vulnerability to that character, perhaps a vulnerability that was not evident in your story, take more of a risk. Perhaps make that character more vulnerable than you were, or approaching the situation in a very different way. I think that many of the problems that we have writing stories that begin as autobiographical stories is that we stick too close to our own story. And it's better to see how far you can stretch from your own story, letting the feelings remain. I think that making the setting and the time period very vivid is helpful, and tying in what happened with the location and with the time period. But writing at all is, if you're not taking any risks, then how moving and how can you convey a feeling of vulnerability to a reader without explaining what the risks are, without showing, say, violence to the character or other characters. Certain stories, if you are too nervous about being vulnerable yourself, vulnerable to criticism, vulnerable to people knowing or suspecting that similar things have happened to you. The thing is that many people assume that everyone in a fictional story, an unsophisticated reader, will assume everyone in a story is real, that was you. So if I wrote a story about a girl in foster care, people assumed that I had been in foster care, which was quite far from the truth. But if there's a personal story that you are compelled to tell, you couch it in as real a world as possible, using all the tools of fiction writing to create that very real world. And then you tell your truth. If you need to portray a scene of violence that you've experienced, or somebody close to you has experienced, and you're afraid that people will know that this happened to you, or perhaps you're the perpetrator. Maybe you created some kind of violence or some kind of criminal act. People will, you have to decide how compelled are you to tell the story. And if you are going to do it, do it. If you hedge, if you allow the emotion to leak out because you're afraid that somebody will suspect it's you, then obviously you're not ready to tell that story. Maybe you have to wait till everybody's dead. Maybe you have to wait till you've had a discussion with people you wanted to protect, so that they are prepared for the fact that you're going to write about this. But to go through life worrying about what you're revealing. If you're not ready to reveal the story, then don't tell the story. Better than trying to hedge your bets and make it, oh, it wasn't so bad. If you want to tell it, go for it. Sometimes you can change who you are in the story. Maybe you want to be fair by being the perpetrator. You want to try to understand why that person was the way they were. Try being the victim. Try being, someone else in the story. Playing with point of view is very good. Victims aren't often in adult fiction. Perhaps it bears another look at point of view that was I really as blameless in the situation as I'd like to have been? Or was I more blameless than I thought I was? I find that taking very different characters and allowing the situation to arise gives it enough of a difference that I feel much more comfortable writing about it than I would in memoir form, saying this happened to me. I'm not a memoirist. I'm somebody who creates worlds in which I can express what's happened to me and what I've seen happen and things that trouble me in a way that I can get hold of them in a way that I could if it was me. Okay, here we're having little bits of, I'm outside, so the Wi-Fi is what it is. I always am up against tech in these broadcasts. So it's very interesting to, you will always create this world because it's part of you. We create out of who we are and what we've seen and what we've thought. And even if I decided to write about, aliens from Venus coming to Earth, I would still end up facing my own issues and the things that bother me, the things that obsess me. You cannot distance yourself from yourself if you're writing honestly, if you're writing deeply. So we were talking about deep POV, and I guess that's the deepest POV, is that you have to write towards the things that obsess you. There's no way not to. So if this is a story that you need to tell about family violence or anything in particular, it will come up. Your characters will be acting out. And it's like a dream in which everyone is you. Everyone is a part of you, is a part of the difficulty. In a dream, you part out the things that trouble you, and each person plays a role in that central drama. It's much better to act out in your fiction than it is to act out in your real life, far more productive. So I hope that's helpful. I wanted to read something. I'm reading James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, which this is backwards, of course, because it's on selfie mode. But he's writing about other people. He's a character who's been very dishonest with himself, knows what's underlying the dishonesty, but it puts a wedge between him and the world. And so he has a very jaundiced view, but a very accurate view of what goes on around him. And here he's talking about somebody who he's borrows money from, he hits him up, and he knows something else. Jacques' vaunted affection for me was involved with desire, the desire, in fact, to be rid of me, to be able soon to despise me, as he now despised the army of boys who had come without love to his bed. And I held my own against this desire by pretending that Jacques and I were friends, by forcing Jacques on the pain of humiliation to pretend this. I pretended not to see, although I exploited it, the lust not quite sleeping in his bright, bitter eyes. So this is, you know, the ability to be harsh with yourself and with others. You know, everybody in our world, we keep saying, oh, but these people are not likable. This is not likable. This is blah, blah, blah. You know, that's going to be something as a writer that you are going to confront over and over again, the unlikability of your characters, which is saying that you're giving voice to something that's unlikable in yourself. And this is the risk. This is the test. Do you dare reveal things about yourself and others, especially yourself, that's unlikable? I recently read Heartberries by Therese Malho, and one of the most remarkable things about it is she is not trying to make herself liked. She is revealing what is unlikable about herself, and that's when we talk about strong work, when we talk about taking risks. That's what we talk about, is the ability to be vulnerable, the ability not to become not even if you are the victim in the story, not to be self-pitying about it, and to, especially if it's an adult story, to understand you're part of the dance, which Giovanni's room at Baldwin is very, very aware of his part in the dance. So that's my advice to you as far as this autobiographical novel. You know, do you really sure you want it to be a novel? Sure you don't want it to be a memoir? If you want it to be fiction, then I would say fictionalize it more, and then use the emotion and have it come through. So here's another question about POV, deep. How are you up for discussion of deep POV? And then it's like how to create deep POV. And I always am up for creating deep POV. That's what I'm all about. I don't write a distant third person. I always want to be inside a character. We feel what they feel, even if in third person. And a lot of that means being in the body, using the senses, making us, you know, physically inside the person, so that if somebody hits you, it's not just the shock, the emotional shock of being hit, but physically that you convey what it feels like, not just naming things, but actually making sure that we're experiencing what you're describing or what you're mentioning. It's raining, so I'm going to go slightly inside, and there we go. It's a little better. So this is also a question of, of when you're deeply inside a character, how much detail do you provide? Some people err on the side of not doing enough detail, and some people err on the side of doing too much detail, and how much is too much. If you are describing something in detail, what it means is that you're signaling to the reader this is important. So if you spend too much time describing the paint on the wall, say, you have to ask yourself, why in the world would a character, it's raining, so I'm going to come in a little bit more. You're asking, you're telling the reader this is important. You need to know, why am I looking at the paint so closely? If there's no reason, then there's no reason for that layer, that much description. Like, what's the difference between saying 2 coats of Home Depot paint versus multiple coats of Chinese lacquer sanded in between each finish? Well, the two things are not congruent. There's 2 different moods involved, 2 different ideas involved in the, 2 layers of Home Depot paint versus that much, it's raining here, which is, or too much, I hope I don't lose the Wi-Fi. Like, why would you be so specific about those layers of Chinese sanded paint? That's somebody looking very lovingly at something. The more closely you describe something, then there's love involved. Just closely describing somebody or even an object like that. So always ask yourself, it's taste. If you have too much of that kind of description, the reader needs a machete to get through it, and you don't want that. So it's asking yourself, why what do I want to draw the reader's attention to? If there's no reason for it, then pull back a little bit. You can still be specific without being fulsome. And then the last question before we lose power, which this might happen to, it's a character, a writer who is a self-taught writer. We're all self-taught, even if people have an MFA, they're still having to learn themselves. Professor pointed out that a recently published piece, congratulations, I have a tendency to use repetition for dramatic effect. I didn't realize the style is passé and cliché. This is not true. It's poetic, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I wouldn't look for a rule about this. You judge every piece for, thank you, somebody likes my hat. You judge every piece in terms of its effectiveness as it is. So what works for one person, repeated words and phrases, is beautiful. It's beautiful. It's poetic language. If it doesn't work, if it just puts people to sleep or it's irritating, then it's a problem. But if it's beautiful, why wouldn't you? Here's an example. I hate her. I want to hate her. The therapist says my hatred is misplaced. I mean, if you've read Play As It Lays, the opening of Play It As It Lays, and it doesn't apply. What applies? Nothing applies. There's nothing dated about that. So just like everything else in fiction, it's taste. It's a sense that, you have to have taste. You have to know or find out whether it works or not. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. If it works, use it. I use it. A lot of wonderful writers use it. It implies an obsessional, word repetition implies an obsessional mindset. If that doesn't fit your character, then think again. But there's something about that revolving around a set of words and phrases. You just keep coming back. It's the obsessional mind. It keeps working its way back in kind of a hamster wheel, right? You can't move forward. If you're trying to move forward, then you don't need that kind of writing. Yeah, Brett has a very good point right here about a comedian who uses an underlying joke and keeps returning to that joke. That happens a lot. So anyway, it's raining here, and I'm going to lose power fairly soon. So anybody has a question, I will answer it now, and then when it dies, then it dies. But we generally, fiction is not autobiographical, and the idea of that somebody's going to be searching for themselves in your book. If somebody did you dirty and you write about it, I mean, the memoirists say, well, they shouldn't have done that. And it's your story, it's your life. If they want to tell it in another way, then they can write their own book. So you can write your own book. When does vulnerability feel false or contrived? Well, you're always pushing yourself to, everything has to come from who those characters are. It can't be slapped on them. There's no such thing as a generic person. And if you want something to happen to people, it has to arise from the conflict between them. And if it seems like it doesn't actually arise from what you've written so far, stay with what you've written rather than pushing it in a direction that it doesn't seem to want to go. Let's see, what else before I lose my power? I can't tell how much power I have, so it's just going to happen all at once. Let's see. So vulnerability, that's the price of being a writer, is that, there we are, we're still here. So, yeah, vulnerability is the price. You have to be willing to use yourself as an emotional lightning rod when you decide to be a writer. If you don't want to be that vulnerable, there's lots of other things you can do with your time. Best examples of deep point of view. Usually, write things that are not in third person. Things that are in first person tend to be a deeper point of view because you are only that person. You only see through their eyes. But I could think of so many writers. You know, this Giovanni's Room, boy, this Baldwin is really knocking me over for point of view. A lot of very sensual writers. I like Jeanette Winterson is a very beautiful writer, and you're deeply in that character. Oh, there's so many. I mean, the great writers. That's what you're going to find. Well, the more internal the story, the more you're going to see that kind of point of view. And some writers just are the opposite. I mean, Hemingway doesn't want you to go that. He wants you to he thinks the human being is a mystery that we look at and we have to put the clues together. And that's a different way. Carver, the same way. The more a character like, like Marguerite Duras, the lover. I mean, that character is willing to admit quite a bit. And so that's a sign of that deep point of view, where a character will admit their unlikability, will admit what's going on with them, and not make you guess or patch it together. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but if you're looking for that way of expressing point of view, something like Push by Sapphire, the character is not a particularly deep, not a ruminative character, but you're definitely very deeply inside them. No, there's so many I can guess. So yeah, so you look for that vulnerability, and the willingness to not be thought well of is an interesting sign. But we always want to hide. I don't know about everybody, but as a fiction writer, generally, I want to hide where my source material comes from. You'll never see a memoir from me, because that's my source material, and I'm not going to use it up in a single reveal. I'm going to use it over and over and over in everything I write. So, any last questions? Okay, well, thank you for joining me for Writing Wednesday, live from the desert, and I'll turn it around and show some more beautiful scenery as the rain comes down. All right, and we'll see you next week. Okay, bye.